You wake up. It's completely dark. No streetlights, no phone glow, no hum of electricity, just black. Total and absolute. And somewhere out there, something is moving. For most of human history, that wasn't a horror movie premise. That was Tuesday night. We like to imagine our ancestors as tough, hardened people who feared nothing. The truth is almost the opposite. Night, for nearly all of human existence, was the single most dangerous and psychologically brutal part of daily life. And once you understand why, you'll never look at a dark room the same way again. Let's start with the obvious problem. Humans are terrible at night. Our eyes are built for daylight. We have poor night vision compared to almost every predator that hunted us. Lions, wolves, hyenas, big cats of every kind, they see far better in low light than we ever could. So the moment the sun dropped below the horizon, the entire balance of power flipped. During the day, humans were dangerous. At night, humans were prey. Early humans knew this. They built their camps around fire not for warmth alone, but because fire was the only technology standing between them and the dark. A fire wasn't just light, it was a wall. It was the only thing keeping the things with glowing eyes at the tree line from stepping closer. If that fire died out in the middle of the night, that wasn't an inconvenience. That was potentially the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. Now imagine that fear stretched out over hundreds of thousands of years, generation after generation, passed down, reinforced, burned into instinct. That's not superstition. That's survival memory. Even today, when you're in an unfamiliar dark room and your heart starts pounding for no logical reason, that's not irrational. That's an inheritance. But predators were only half the terror. The other half was what the night did to the mind. Ancient people didn't have streetlights. They didn't have flashlights. They didn't have the ability to simply flood a space with light at the flick of a switch. When the sun set, the world didn't just get dark, it disappeared. Trees became shapeless masses. Paths vanished. Sound became the primary sense. And sound in the dark is deeply unreliable. A branch snapping could be the wind. Or it could be a bear. You had no way to know, and your brain, denied the information it needed, filled in the blanks with the worst possible answer. This is why so many ancient cultures, completely independently of one another, developed the same core belief. That night was when the veil between worlds grew thin. In Mesopotamia, night was ruled by demons like Lamashto, who was said to stalk the darkness hunting for children. In ancient Rome, the hours after midnight were considered the domain of restless spirits, the lemures, wandering souls who could not rest. In parts of ancient China, night was associated with yin energy, the negative and passive force, and certain hours were considered actively dangerous to be outdoors in. Across nearly every ancient civilization, separated by oceans, language, and thousands of miles, the conclusion was identical. Night is when the dangerous things come out. Not just animals, something else. Why would cultures with zero contact independently invent the same fear? Because it wasn't culture creating the fear. It was experience. People really were dying at night. From animal attacks, from exposure, from getting lost and falling into ravines, from raids by hostile groups who used darkness as cover. The supernatural explanations came after. They were an attempt to make sense of a threat that felt too consistent, too patterned to be pure accident. And that brings us to one of the most overlooked terrors of ancient night: other humans. Darkness was the perfect weapon for raiders. Village attacks, cattle theft, ambushes, these were overwhelmingly planned for the night, specifically because visibility was gone and defenses were weakest. If you lived in a village near a hostile border or contested territory, nightfall wasn't peaceful. It was the opening of a window where anything could happen, and no one would see it coming until it was already too late. Watchmen existed for exactly this reason. Someone had to stay awake, straining their eyes into blackness, because the alternative was worse than exhaustion. Then there's something we barely think about now: the psychological weight of silence. In a world without engines, without electricity humming through walls, true silence was common. And true silence at night, combined with total darkness, does something specific to the human brain. It sharpens paranoia. Every tiny sound gets amplified in your imagination. Ancient people didn't have the luxury of dismissing a strange noise as probably nothing. Too often, it wasn't nothing. This is also where a huge portion of folklore comes from, not as decoration, but as function. Stories about monsters that only appear at night, about spirits who steal children who wander outside after dark, about the dead who walk when the sun goes down. These weren't just scary bedtime tales, they were behavioral tools. If a child grows up terrified of what lurks past the tree line at night, that child doesn't wander off after dark. Fear, in this context, was a survival mechanism disguised as a story. The scarier the tale, the more effective the warning. And it worked in the opposite direction too. Communities used the fear of night to enforce order. Curfews weren't just about control, they were about keeping people alive. Stay inside, stay near the fire, stay together. Because outside those boundaries, in the true dark, you were on your own. And being on your own at night in the ancient world was a genuinely lethal position to be in. Even sleep itself worked differently. Historians have found strong evidence that pre-industrial humans often practiced something called segmented sleep, waking in the middle of the night for an hour or more before falling back asleep. Partly this was tied to the rhythm of a world, without artificial light, forcing an unnatural, unbroken 8-hour block. But that waking period had another use. It was a natural checkpoint, a moment to listen, to make sure the fire hadn't died, to make sure everything outside the walls was still exactly as it should be. Now stack all of this together. Poor night vision against far superior predators, a total loss of visual information forcing the brain into worst-case scenario thinking, real human threats who used darkness deliberately as a weapon. Cultural and religious systems worldwide reinforcing that night belonged to something other than us, and an entire evolutionary history of ancestors who did not survive by treating the dark casually. That's not a coincidence of superstition. That's an accumulated, evidence-based terror, refined across thousands of generations. So the next time the power goes out, and you're standing in your house in total blackness, feeling that flicker of primal unease creep up your spine, understand what that actually is. It's not weakness. It's not irrational. It's the oldest alarm system your species ever built, still wired into you, still whispering the same warning it whispered to every human who came before you. The sun is down. Stay close to the fire. Something is out there. And for most of human history, that something was very, very real.